Whooping Crane Chronicles is a collection of stories to learn from, to ponder, and to celebrate. I'm Mike Forsberg, a conservation photographer from the Great Plains. I've spent the last 5 years, camera in hand, exploring the natural history of whooping cranes across the continent, meeting the people who love them, and discovering how these tall, magnificent, and rarest of cranes are navigating our 21st century world. This podcast elevates conservation stories and uplifts these birds to showcase their natural history and beauty in the hope of keeping these birds around for generations to come. Join me on the journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Whooping Crane Chronicles. Today we're coming to you from the International Crane Foundation headquarters outside of Baraboo, Wisconsin, a place that has become a global epicenter for crane conservation. Our guest today is Dr. Rich Beilfuss, President and CEO of the International Crane Foundation. Rich has spent decades working to protect cranes and the wild places they depend on, and I'm especially grateful to have him here. I'm also grateful because he wrote the foreword to my latest book, Into Whooperland. So, Rich, it's great to have you on our little podcast. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, Mike. It's great to be on here, and welcome to Baraboo.
Yeah.
So
thanks. Yeah. I think I've been to Baraboo now probably a dozen times, but this is the first time that I've been here at this time in the spring, where in the last week looks like things are all of a sudden full of new green, and there's birds besides cranes.
So many. This is our time of year. I travel heavily all year, but I always put a big blackout on May, because that is the time. That's our time. That's migratory birds and blooming plants, and
gosh,
it is our month. Yeah.
I think yesterday, rose-breasted grosbeaks, Baltimore Orioles, of course, lots of warblers that I don't know.
They're all moving through now. It's sort of a frantic time too, in a fun way, but those of us who are addicted to birding are trying to run around and catch everything that passes through in a couple-week window, and it's sort of weirdly exhausting, but very fun.
Sounds like you're addicted to birding, Rich.
I am addicted to birding.
Yeah. Did you guys have like a birdathon or some sort of, what happens up here?
This is a great old, I go out birding this sort of first week of May with the same guys for about 20, 25 years. And in the early days, we sort of birded part of the day and nibbled on nice cheeses and had a beer at the end of the day. And then it's gotten a little more ramped up over the years it's probably as much my fault as anything. But so this year we went from basically 9 p.m. Monday night to 9 p.m. Tuesday night, pretty much straight through owls in the dark and whippoorwills. And we get a little nap in, and then we get up and we're out at 4 a.m, and we're running all over the southern part of the state trying to tick as many birds as we can. And the hilarious thing, you see so many amazing birds, and then you have everyday birds that you miss because they just don't pop up during the day. I don't think we had a bald eagle till like the very end of the night. Just very common birds in this area. So it's always fun, and it involves a bit of luck. A lot of adventure. It's great.
How do you bird at night?
Just by calls. So we had a very funny thing actually. We were with a guy, we were playing little owl tapes to get owls to call back, and we called in an eastern screech owl, which was very funny, and he kind of came in close, and then we could not get a barred owl, which is the most famous of all calls, that who cooks for you kind of call. And then we tried with the official tape 3 or 4 times. They didn't respond. We thought, they're not around. And then a guy with our group did his version, and they responded immediately, and they were just on a tree or barn, like right next to us. So they'd been listening to the tapes and like, nah. And then he did this call and they responded immediately.
What was different about his tape?
I don't know, but he had a very good owl call, I would say. That's what he did. But it was amazing. We laughed and laughed. We decided that was our highlight of the year.
Did anything surprise you?
There's always surprises, always a bird moving through you don't expect. For us, some birds like cerulean warblers are kind of a treat. That's a floodplain bird and deep forest bird, and we don't see much of them. We picked up one of those, and there's always adventure. And then because we're sort of competitive about our number, there's always that sort of late night tally where like, we didn't see it. You're kind of going through the stuff, and there's always 3 or 4 birds that I wake up in the morning and they're in my backyard, but we missed them all day the day before. So it's a funny thing. But
how many did you tally?
We were in the 130s. We haven't tallied up, so it was low by our normal. We usually get up around 150, 170 ish.
Awesome.
We've all been doing it together for quite a while. So yeah,
that's great. You are from Wisconsin.
I grew up in Chicago, but I moved up here I moved up here for graduate school. Yeah. I moved here to learn the Nepali language. It's one of 2 places in the country where you can learn the language of Nepal. It's sort of my weird connection to Wisconsin, but I moved up here for that and just pretty much fell in love and stayed ever since. Went to grad school here and work and
So what part of Chicago you come from?
West. I was born in the city, but grew up in just west of Chicago. But kind of, I'm a hydrologist, so I say the edge of the city water from Lake Michigan as it transitions to country water from wells, and so. But like sort of LaGrange area, just straight west, about 8 or 9 miles from downtown.
What was it like growing up as a kid?
We loved Chicago, so I associate strongly with Chicago. I ran into town a lot. The 2 things that shaped me were like sort of downtown Chicago blues music and just kind of running around and being a teenager at the time in Chicago. And then the Forest Preserve system, which is an underrated gem of Chicago's. They had real foresight. New York has its famous Central Park, but Chicago has a more dispersed woodland system, and we did everything out there, from partying out there as kids to hiking in the woods to biking and running and everything. And it's sort of ribbons of green space that follow rivers and all in Chicago. And I didn't know it at the time when I was a kid, but there's been just extraordinary work there, conservation work, and kind of the discovery of the savanna and its own unique vegetation in our eastern U.S. context. It's always been seen as kind of a transition from prairie plants to woodland plants, but it has its own unique species, and those were found in the Chicago area. And now we're seeing birds that are kind of unique to that, like our red-headed woodpeckers and all that key in on that sort of unique sort of transition system. So that was fun. Yeah. I'm very closely connected to Chicago, too much for living in Wisconsin. I'm a Bears fan, and everybody I know is a Packers fan. I'm a Cubs fan. Everybody I know is a Brewers fan. So anyway, I live in my little sports isolation here.
So you grew up in Chicago. You're a hydrologist by training. You came here to study Nepalese. You're like this sort of Renaissance guy.
I don't know about that. I was a kid trying to find my way in undergraduate. I was at Northwestern, which is in Chicago. And I met an extraordinary guy who taught it's like the power of a good class. I took this class called Politics and Land of South Asia, and was just kind of it was a string of things about Gandhi, about land use, about conservation, about global politics in that region and all. Really loved it. And he could see I was kind of starry-eyed in there, and he said, you should go up to Madison and meet a guy named Joe Elder, who's an extraordinary human being. He just passed away. And talk about their year in India and Nepal program. So I went up on a weekend and drove up, and in the course of a meeting, he convinced me to go to Nepal for a year. So I did as a 20-year-old kid. I went to Nepal. This was all pre-email, everything. I talked to my parents twice in the year I was there on telephone, which was pretty extraordinary. I think about that, talking to your kids twice in a year. Now it's like unthinkable. So it really, it shaped me as a pretty independent being, I'll say. But I got pretty fluent at Nepali in Madison, and then went to Nepal and lived off of smattering of Nepali and English for a year there through this program. And it was completely changed my life. So I came back to graduate school, decided to be a hydrologist, and came back to Madison really to focus on water because of the water issues I saw while I was in Nepal and all the change. And inspired onto that path. And that's sort of how I ended up here, really. So
our conservation challenges then and today are multifaceted on all these different systems levels, right? So why water?
Yeah, well, I I originally got into water through this kind of epiphany in Nepal. I was walking across a stream in Kathmandu, in the capital of Nepal, where people bathe, drink, cremate bodies. It's a religious and very central river in Kathmandu. And I walked across the river. I had a few cuts on my legs from just being out and about. And a day or two later, they all got infected. And I had this epiphany, like that infection came from that water, and that water is the drinking water, cooking water, everything life source for these people. It was really like a mind-blowing epiphany for me. At the time I was probably 21, then I turned 21 while I was over there. And I was like, this is what I'm going to work on. I'm going to clean up this water. And that's what I thought. I came back and I was like, I want to be a civil engineering, and I want civil engineering, and I want to clean up water. It was sort of my, my track and focus. And then I later connected with ICF and shifted to more of what I'd call ecological water. Got very interested in water wildlife connections, but it started with this kind of water quality issue that really struck me profoundly while I was there. Yeah.
Well, we'll get back to that in a little bit, because I'm sure that shaped you and your leadership role here with ICF. But I want to get to the connection to cranes and ICF here, so I'm going to read you a list of states right now, and I'm going to ask you where you think this list comes from.
Okay.
Texas, California, Florida, Illinois, Minnesota, Tennessee, Nebraska.
So where that list comes from?
It comes from the ICF campus.
Oh, okay. Well, immediately I think Craney. These are places where we have directors, board of directors. We have.
Thinking too hard.
Oh, I'm thinking too hard. Okay.
I'm going to look this way.
Our current associates and interns?
Is it?
Oh, well, there we go.
So these are the license plates that are sitting outside.
Ah, nice. Very nice.
The guest house. So, and every time I come up here, I always look at the license plates of all the cars before I meet all the young people.
And tell us about the new license plate that you saw here, the colorful new.
Well, you should tell us about the new license plate. Yes, it's the Wisconsin license plates. Lovely.
Well, we have a wonderful new Craney, Wisconsin plate now that features whoopers and sandhills on the left and kind of a wetland farm scene in the background. That's our brand new license plate we debuted last year.
Which is a great coup, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk about that too. But we're going to keep going on your early path here first.
All right.
So you came here to the International Crane Foundation as an intern?
Yeah, I was an intern. I was really a graduate student desperately looking to get back overseas. I came back from Nepal, fell in love with hydrology and with international work, and I was interviewing at the Peace Corps office and kind of thinking, okay, what do you do when you go to the Peace Corps if you want to break into international work? And then I came up here, and I can tell you the reason I came up here, which is another weird story, but I basically came up here and saw this place, and it was like, this is something I can do. Like, I got really excited about the international mission of ICF. It was an old film strip at the time that was shown at the visitor center, and it was just about some of really George's early work and Jim Harris and some of our early founders, and it was exciting. So. Yeah, and I came up here. I was in a Tai Chi class. I came back from Nepal. I was also searching in many ways, searching religiously, searching every way, and got into this Tai Chi class. And one day the Tai Chi instructor said, we're going to go to this place about an hour north of here called Baraboo, and they have these gigantic birds, these cranes. And if we do Tai Chi, they will do Tai Chi with us. And that's a true story, and that's how I found out about this place. So we drove up on some day and stood, and one of the cranes I knew later was Wolf, who was this almost 80-year-old Siberian crane that lived forever in captivity. It's the all-time age record holder by almost 30 years. Amazing bird.
And Wolf was here?
Wolf was here. Siberian crane spent the last years of his life with us, but was dated back to World War I era Germany. This bird has quite a history, but maybe that's a story for another time.
Yeah.
But anyway, Wolf stayed very, like a lot of cranes do, stayed aggressive in captivity in defending his space. At the time, we thought they were up to dance with us. We thought this is like mystical. We were up doing the crane form in front of these pens, and the birds were doing what they do, which is sort of pacing back and forth and occasionally doing beautiful drop wing threats or unison calls. And, you know, to us, it was all just mimicking our Tai Chi, and we were blown away. So I saw the birds and was impressed with the birds. I did think they were being friendly, and of course later learned they were attempting to chase us away and being as hostile as they possibly could be. That's sort of the beauty of the story. But we connected with these birds. But it was this little film strip that got me, because the film strip, I saw the cranes in Baraboo, but the film strip sort of opened up the world. It was, wow, we're doing international work on these birds, and these birds need a lot of water, and this seems like a pretty cool thing to do, and they like to do Tai Chi. Like, it was ticking all my boxes. So there it was. So I came here as an internship, but we were just starting work in Vietnam. So I wrote in that essay for George's book. One day I just kind of like walked up to him and was like, poured forth. And George, in the way he was like, great, go to Vietnam, you know. So it kind of like evolved. There was another guy, Jeb Basin, here at the time, and Jeb and I worked together a lot, and we went off to Vietnam together in the January of 1989, and then I worked most of the next 3 years there it was at the time my master's, and then just doing whatever needed to be done as we were kind of working on these SARS cranes there.
Yeah,
so,
I was going to say SARS
yeah, that
cranes,
was SARS
right?
cranes.
Yeah.
So that was really my crane entry drug.
Well,
Yeah.
that's a big one too.
Yeah, that was a big one.
Literally and figuratively, right?
Right. And I don't believe, which is hard to say these days, I don't believe I had ever seen a sandhill crane in the wild before I started here. Not a whooping crane, which I definitely hadn't seen, but a sandhill crane when I started here. There were very few in Wisconsin. We take them for granted today. They're everywhere here.
Yeah.
You know, but was not so 40 years ago. Was not like that at all. Now I know from having been here where a few pairs were, but they were very few. Yeah. It's a shocking story. Most people think we built here to be close to the cranes, but the truth is we built here and the cranes came. So, yeah.
It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
It's sort of, you know, at the center of the universe here between you all at ICF and then the Leopold Foundation, the shack right down the road.
Right, absolutely.
Being a great fan of Leopold and all of his work, and reading, of course, Marshland Elegy, but the entire Sand County Almanac, if you were reading it at the time that it came out, like you said, if you would read what Leopold, the way he was writing about it, is he had every expectation that these birds were not going to be here on the landscape anymore, correct?
Yeah, right. Marshland Elegy was kind of a Marshland eulogy too, right? It was, it was very much that. Yeah. I think 6 pair known in southern Wisconsin when he wrote that, something like that. So, just a remarkable recovery.
So what changed? I mean, how did that, I know that's a question that you could write volumes on, of course, and we can talk at length about, but what changed?
Yeah, so there's a few fundamentals that are still very relevant today. Certainly the Migratory Bird Treaty Act ended the period of market hunting for sandhills, and we know... And
that was in 1918 or somewhere in there, right?
Yeah, that we had here in Wisconsin that period of intensive market hunting where literally animals were harvested and shipped to Chicago straight to restaurants. It was like the original farm to table, but in a very bad way, right? And so our prairie chickens loaded in to Chicago, and our cranes, right? And our... many species, our passenger pigeons, of course, which we lost altogether. And it cut off that big market hunting. People still may have shot cranes here and there, but that super pressure. So there was that. And then I think existentially a real shift for the cranes from prairie feeders to corn feeders. And now we're learning more and more that cranes can almost switch overnight to that. At the time, we don't know if it was a big shift for cranes to kind of except their prairies were gone, 99% of their prairies were gone, and they had to shift to corn, how they thought about that in their crane heads, or they just switch for food. We've seen we've seen that happen worldwide. If a food source crashes, they're resilient, but they were resilient. And I think for a lot of farmlands here, we got a little lucky compared to like Iowa, Illinois, and all, where they lost their wetlands and their farm and their grasslands. Here, mostly the wetlands stayed intact, surrounded by farms. People watered their dairy cattle with the wetlands, whatever they did with them. So the cranes had their wetlands, and then they had abundant food And they loved it. And, they're a species that can pull off 2 chicks a year, and that math, as we know, compared to whoopers, is very good math.
Yeah, right.
2, 4, 6, 8 instead of
right.
1, 2, 3, 4. And the cranes, I think, just took off. They weren't getting hunted anymore. They had a habitat, even though transformed. And that was to me, that's kind of the simple story, and it's just good math. And now I think they're probably leveling off, with huge predator issues that I'm sure are affecting sandhills a lot and all. But that initial just good exponential growth, and here they are. But as you mentioned, Leopold, there were no cranes roosting on this river when I started here. And now we get, on a stretch of our Wisconsin River here, we get almost 10,000 sandhills roosting. It's not the Platte River, but it's our own slice of heaven, and it's wonderful. Yeah.
We have a lot of listeners to this podcast. They know about cranes, and if they know about cranes, they know about cranes where they're at, the place that they live. So for folks that don't know about the Wisconsin birds or the eastern flyway birds, could you describe a little bit about them?
Sure. So our Wisconsin birds they don't mix with your Platte River birds, as you know well. And somewhere in the eastern part of Minnesota, there's a transition from birds that move, what we call the central flyway birds. I'm waving my arms here for no purpose, but so the central flyway birds, we're the eastern migratory population, as we call it. And our birds breed in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ontario especially. Now they're starting to establish all over the East, probably as they did 100 years ago before all the market hunting. But they, especially, I would say, Wisconsin, Michigan, a bit of Minnesota for sure, and Ontario are really important. And then they migrate south in the winter, probably 100 years ago, further south than they do today, down in maybe southern parts of Alabama, Georgia, Florida. Now they're what we call short stopping a lot. Some cranes are actually overwintering here, and plenty are overwintering in central southern Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, kind of that area. There's big festivals that have sprung up there that probably couldn't have existed, very long ago. And so those birds are spending the winter down there, mostly on cornfields, and then migrating up here, and then they pick out wetlands and farm fields mostly, and breed up here. So
So the birds that you watch come to the Wisconsin River to roost in the fall.
They are in the fall. Yeah, that's a difference with the Platte. Our congregation happens more in the fall than the spring. Our birds tend to beeline to their breeding ground in the spring, and in the fall they gather. And at our Wisconsin River here, which has some nice sandbars, I'd say a lot of the birds are coming from Ontario, northern Wisconsin, and then our local breeding birds kind of move on south, and then this wave of birds starts coming in from all over the north and filling up the Wisconsin River as a roost, and then they go out and feed on farm fields during the day in that area. So,
do you ever see a big white one in the mix?
It's rare. We do sometimes see them. I have never seen a whooper on roost on the Wisconsin River, but our team has. Our team that's out much more than I am. But I've definitely seen whoopers in the cornfields, so they will mix a bit. And there are a few needle in the haystack, but they're there. So
we'll talk about them in a bit too. I'm going to go back and pull on the Rich Beilfuss young man thread here a little bit more. You came here to ICF, ended up going immediately to Vietnam, pretty much with Jeb, and then you came back.
Yeah, I came back, and this is a classic ICF story. I'd spent a good part of 4 years in Southeast Asia, a lot of time in Vietnam. We were trying to establish what became a new national park in Vietnam called Tram Chim. It's quite a great long-term story I won't really go into, but we were working hard on this park, and then doing a water management plan and trying to restore this population of Saurus cranes there. And I worked on all of that, and then I came, and ICF hired me at that point. I was working off graduate student fellowships and things to kind of pay the bills through that time. And then January of 1992, I was hired by ICF full-time, presumably I thought to work in Southeast Asia, and I was not even at my new desk for a month. It might have been 2 or 3 weeks. And George said, I got to go over to Nigeria to give a talk, and I can't go. Would you go? So I went, and I learned a lot of things about ICF. Like I showed up in Nigeria, and nobody really knew I was coming, and I didn't have any hotels or anything, and became quite an adventure to end up where I ended up. But all of that sort of exposed me to the interesting challenges of international work and working in Africa, and loved Nigeria. And I was at a black-crowned crane meeting, and I met a lot of people that we didn't know, ICF-wise, and I kind of came back, and George was like, well, why don't you work on Africa? Jeff's going to do Asia, you work on Africa. It's like, okay. And that was like sort of the birth of our Africa program. So we was very much at that time about a few people we knew here and there, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and I started out kind of connecting with them and then just built out that program for about 15 years, just flew back and forth all the time. And that really became my job. I went back to Vietnam a few more times. I loved it there, and Nepal a couple of times for other things, but really became a big focus was building out this Africa program there for endangered species, all with water issues. So I was very excited to be working on water and cranes and doing that program.
So what are those 4 species?
So there's 2 of the beautiful crowned cranes, really elegant crowned crane birds. There's a gray crowned crane that ranges Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda down to South Africa.
Yeah.
And then there's a very similar looking black crowned crane, just darker in color, very similar, from Ethiopia west to Senegal across the band. That bird gets the award for just the worst possible 21st century range. They range across countries we only hear bad news about, Sudan, South Sudan, Chad, Ethiopia, Mali, Niger. These are all countries with massive insurgencies, huge political struggles. That's where they range. So that bird, even though it was the first African crane I connected with ICF, is the one that we've been most challenged with for really developing a program. But we do a lot for that gray crown crane. And then the 2 other cranes are the wattled crane, which was the one that really captured my heart. And they range across these enormous floodplains in kind of South Central Africa. And then the blue crane, very different bird, is a mostly agricultural upland bird that roosts in wetlands in South Africa, primarily in South Africa. So there'd been a lot of work happening on the blue cranes in South Africa, even back in those days, and a lot of work in East Africa around the crown cranes, but very few people were looking at these wattled cranes. And that's where I decided to just really focus in. So
how did they capture your heart?
Well, they're a floodplain dependent bird, and I love floodplains. They are a bird that is very specialized to feed on the tubers of plants that grow. That's a plant called Eleochris. We have it here in the US, but in Africa it produces tubers, in Asia too, that the cranes feed on. And those tubers are only produced when you have a natural cycle of flood and drought. So to survive flooding and survive drought, they lay down these tubers, and that's what the cranes come in and feed. And you need soil moisture for them to penetrate the soil and get at these. So they just became to me like the perfect indicator of good hydrologic conditions. And I kind of transitioned, eventually did my PhD there on those conditions and how they related to the management of big dams on the Zambezi River, which was one of the big river systems that was flooding all this wattled crane habitat. So sort of like, how can we think about these dams with respect to the water needs of cranes? And I guess I can go on with that story. This was sort of my other ICF origin story, really. I realized day 2 of thinking about these birds that we were never going to get any water out of the dam for some birds in Africa and some of the poorest parts of the world. And we needed cooperative strategies that made a bigger case for water. And that led to the human case for water, because the same water that was being affected for cranes was being affected for fisheries and for people who farmed the floodplains of the river channel and grazed their cattle. So that sort of trying to balance those crane needs and human needs and make a more unified case for water was really the driver of my first 10 years with ICF. Was all around that, trying to make that case, put economically, socially, politically, ecologically, that case for water. Yeah.
Well, that's still pretty darn applicable today, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a story on the Platte.
It's a story we know in the Great Plains.
Yeah.
And how that translates to the wood buffalo, to Aransas population, whooping cranes. I mean, it sounds very similar in a lot of ways, even though it's halfway around the world and completely different cultures. You're still dealing with rungs on a migration ladder that are reliant on these naturally functioning floodplains that for the most part are ghost rivers anymore because of dams and diversion and groundwater pumping and all of these things. Yet you still have the resilience of these birds that remarkably are still here.
Right.
And you're right in the sense too that, I mean, every wildlife story is a human story today because we're everywhere and we control everything, so we get to decide what stays, and it's our self-interest first, whatever that is, right? Whatever it is that we care about. And so you were here, so you moved into the role of developing an African program, and continues today. In fact, I'm looking right now over your right shoulder, and there's 3 flags that are flying. I always love to see who the flags are that are out when I come back here, and I don't know who chooses the flags and who flies them, but the middle one. So there's Canada and the U.S., which is very appropriate today, and then right in the middle is Uganda's.
Right. Well, our most recent international visitor was our program leader who lives in Uganda. Dr. Adalba Ngozi, and he was visiting with us. That's about a month ago, and we tend to leave up the flags of whoever visits us until the next visitor comes. And we don't have a Nebraska flag, or we fly a Nebraska flag for you.
Well, we'll get you one.
But so we fly those flags. I love it. So we have a collection of about 50 something flags that we fly for whoever visits. And it's always one of the great moments when we have new people come in here, because we'll bring them up from the airport and they'll often get their first photo here posed under that flag with a great prairie background. It's all restored prairie behind. But and of course Uganda is a good one to have up, because Uganda is maybe the craniest country on earth. Their flag has a crane right in the middle of it. But we're really flying it because of Adalbert's visit.
I watched your 10-year vision presentation that was on their webinar series. I think that was last week.
Yeah.
It may seem like months ago for now for you. It's how busy you are. And in the front section, when you were sort of making a case for crane's sake, was it the gray-crowned crane that was marching alongside a parade?
Yeah, the gray-crowned crane is the mascot of the Zambian army. And so they have trained several crown cranes to actually march.
It's remarkable
with them, and it is a remarkable piece of footage, and I often show it when I talk about the sort of the complexity of our relationship with cranes, and because it's an amazing thing. And one time I was in Zambia in the Kafue Flats, where we do a lot of work, and there was a group from the army that out there trying to catch a bird for their new mascot, and we were like, we don't want you to do that, but we can't say anything because you're armed and we're not. And
right. Wow.
So we were kind of trying to protest a little bit, not wanting them to grab the crane, but they weren't going to really listen to us. What they do, they catch them, domesticate them, not a lot, but some, and teach them to march to the army. It's quite amazing, those birds walking down the streets of the capital.
So I'm going to show you a picture. I'm going to ask you to respond to it. Tell me what you see. So this is out of George Archibald's book that was published 5 or 6 years ago, maybe now, called My Life with Cranes, a collection of stories, and you wrote a piece in here. But there's a great picture. I had never seen this picture before, and it's in the afterword. It's on page 151, and for our podcast audience, we'll put that up as one of the extras. I'll show the group here first.
Oh yeah. I actually know where that photo was taken. So
it's George and Rich walking shoulder to shoulder, if you will, both very dressed up in smart-looking suits, and you're obviously urban somewhere, but you both have big smiles on your face.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin, we were. Yeah.
Is that where you were? So what do you see because this is a younger version of you?
Yeah.
And of George, of course.
Yeah.
What do you see when you look at that picture?
Well, yeah, certainly long-term friendship and work together. It's a great photo. It's funny to see us in suits, because I'm sure 99% of the time we have spent together has been not in suits. But, I first met George, as I said, when I was up here in 1988 when I came as an internship and worked together. I left ICF for about 4 years in the middle, but most of that time I've been here. And it's been a fantastic journey. That was I know that photo because that's when we were celebrating I believe that would have been our 40th anniversary. And I think we had a big event where Jane Goodall came and spoke, and it was quite a great kind of fancy event for us. We hadn't done a lot of those over the years, so it was kind of a spring out big event. A lot of people in the room from Wisconsin, Chicago, Madison, Milwaukee, and all. And so it was great. You know, it was a really fun event and a great celebration. I remember that. And with that was, we were at the Discovery Center in Milwaukee, and somebody took that shot. So yeah.
So that was 12 years ago or so.
I think so.
Somewhere in there. At ICF, you ascended to your leadership role that you have now as president and CEO in what year?
2009, more or less. I was a sort of interim director for 4 or 5 months or something, and then became a CEO. I had left ICF and moved to Mozambique, so my passion for developing our Africa program led to a kind of an interesting job offer from a guy who had made a multi-million-dollar commitment to one specific place in Mozambique. And I met him when I was working in Mozambique, and he said, I really need to build a team and restore this area. And it was right where I'd been doing my PhD work. I knew it well, probably as much as anybody in the world at the time, this kind of part of Mozambique. And he said, do you want to move over? And I said, I'll pay for your family to move over. I had one little one, and my wife was pregnant actually with our second kid. And we took the bait, we moved over, and I lived there. And then it was when I was leaving, I had a 4-year contract, and it was when I was leaving to come back and putting out feelers that ICF invited me to come back in. At the time I was head of programs, but it was clear that was going to transition quickly to CEO. So yeah, went back in. So
that's a big job.
Yeah, so it was a big change. Yep. I think I spent the first 5 years desperately trying to stay in the field. I laugh a lot about, I'll put Andy on the spot here, but we have Andy Caven with us right now, who's our VP for North America. And Andy has that same desperation of moving into leadership and desperate to be in the field, including sleeping in a tent with you for 2 weeks in Wood Buffalo and all those great stories. And I feel his pain and joy. I just want to say that. I joke with him a lot about that, but I was exactly the same. Absolutely desperate to stay in the field, still running to Africa all the time, still doing environmental flows work, which was the field of hydrology I was in, the sort of water for people and wildlife stuff and all of that. And then somewhere along the line, maybe in the 5 to 10 year ago range, I embraced the leadership role. You know, I put away my childish things.
How did you do that, actually? I mean, what was that? You just woke up one day and said, all right, or...
I realized I had to do my job. You know, I had a great relationship with the board, and I was doing all this stuff, and I just realized I needed to focus on actually being a leader and leading this organization and kind of give up that stuff. And it was, wouldn't say it was overnight, but it was sort of intentional. I was reading books on leadership and like asking myself, am I a leader or not, or what am I doing? You know, I was sort of a leader on the work I was doing. But I didn't feel institutional, I would say, fully in the way that I do now. And it's a mix of a lot of things. Part of it is letting go of stuff and kind of next generation taking it over. There's an important element of that. But also just recognizing to really lead an organization is a very different role from kind of being, you know, it's so important to be out and learning. And the fact that I've kind of been everywhere we work, and I know pretty much everybody we work with is absolutely invaluable to the leadership I do, I think, you know, but somebody I kind of had to pull back and say, okay, I need to be really focused on fundraising. I need to be focused on high level strategic development, but not kind of micro level stuff, and on building strong team and building a really strong leadership team and all that kind of stuff. And I just shifted my attention to that, you know, over some time period. Maybe it was 10 years ago, but it was after a period of struggle to stay in the field for sure. Yeah. And sort of do those dual roles. Yeah.
So it's not really fair to ask you what a week is like for you, because every week I know for you is very different week to week. But if you could characterize what a year is like for you generally in your position now, what's the balance of things that you...
Yeah, it's a great question. I get, sort of asked that a lot, and I'm never good at answering it because there's a certain element of just ever changing that is is hard to put your mind around. So right now I would say certainly what I would call reputation enhancement is a big part of what I try to do. Giving talks, connecting with supporters. We've gone into these new long-term agreements, which I really prize and promote. And these are like 10 or 20-year commitments to places or to species in some cases, but often really to places, and really building out the politics and the partnerships of those long-term relationships. I put a lot of energy into those at that sort of high level that's needed, especially in the early stages, to kind of build them out, the political connections and all that. So I would say a lot of that, and then fundraising is never far from that. We have a great fundraising team here. We have a great fundraising culture at ICF, I would say, across programs and development, traditional development department, but kind of helping, involved in all aspects of that is big. And then a lot of the last 2 years, when I'm not doing that stuff, has been around putting forward a new vision for ICF. Strategic planning and vision is another one of my kind of board level set goals. And we just finished a 10-year vision in 2014. So we did a big wrap up of that, kind of what we learned, how that went, and then set our sights on a new vision for the next 10 years. And what I loved about the vision, it's kind of in the talk that I've been giving, it's a little bit of reflecting back and, and thinking about, what we've accomplished in the last 10 years and how our last 10-year vision helped us get where we are today. And that's important. And then it's a process I like called horizon scanning, where we just try to look out to the horizon and see what's out there before we even talk about what specifically we want to achieve in the next decade. And I look out on the horizon today and I see China as a country with 9 species of cranes, and they're not in the news for good reason. Every day we're rattling our sabers at each other, and every day I wake up hoping we still have good diplomatic relations with China, because it's one of the most important countries in the world for our mission and our work. And ditto for Russia, for Myanmar, for all those countries in West Africa I mentioned, all those craney places, sort of day to day. So it's the horizon scan is kind of reading politically, thinking about where we're going to be at with climate change in 10 years. How should we think about that? Where are we going to be at with social issues in the U.S., the rural divide in the U.S.? How might that affect our global work? We sit in Wisconsin here, right on that divide, I think, of urban populations and rural populations that are less and less getting along, I think we can say. And here we sit, and we work in many countries where those divides are very similar, wealthy urban areas and poorer rural areas trying to make a country. So yeah, really just thinking out on the horizon about all that stuff and how it'll affect what we want to do in the next decade, how we'll raise the money to do it, build the reputation we need to see it through. Yeah, all of that. So those are the big picture things. And then there's a lot of time on email and texts, and I don't even want to think about how many hundreds of hours I spend on email and all that stuff, because it just happens, and it somehow contributes to what I just talked about somehow. But it's all out there anyway.
It's all, even podcasts, you got to sit down and talk to people.
Yeah.
But I think it all makes a difference, though, doesn't it? I mean, because you never know who you're going to reach. You never know who you're going to talk to. You never know what that spark moment is going to be for someone, in the same way that you had a spark moment. Well, you've had a few.
Yeah.
through your career.
So true. Yeah, I think that's a quality I did learn from George. He, one thing I've always admired is he will sit late at night and write letters to any kid that reaches out for help, any community member, anyone, or now it's all emails. In the old days, he wrote letters. And yeah, I sort of adopted that same philosophy. You never know who you're going to touch, who's going to become a craniac. So you just communicate with everybody. I actually love talking with our interns and our associates. We usually do a gathering and talk about careers, and just encouraging people. Yeah.
So the name of our podcast is Whooping Crane Chronicles, and we don't just talk about whooping cranes, but that seems to be the thread that ties everybody together that we talk with. Given what we just heard from you about your 10-year vision, and given your depth of experience over the years working in water space and internationally and urban rural divides and all of those things, how does that translate to ICF's work and vision for whooping cranes today and tomorrow? Because I know that there's been several reintroductions. Those reintroductions had a Florida reintroduction that had some success, but eventually failed.
Right.
Rocky Mountain, Grace Lake to New Mexico migratory reintroduction that ended up failing. Learned some things from that.
Right, right.
You have the Eastern Flyway experiment that's happening now, that's going on almost 25 years.
Yep.
And then the Louisiana, really a reintroduction from an extirpated population from about 1950 or so that started in 2011.
Right, right.
You have that as context, and you look at the historical distribution of whooping cranes as best science knows at the time, which had a wide range throughout North America. And it doesn't mean that they were as ubiquitous perhaps as the sandhill crane was, but nevertheless, they were in lots of places. And then today we have the wood buffalo to Aransas population that's migrating up a very narrow 250 mile wide or so corridor, 2,500 miles twice a year.
Right.
There's a lot of story about the birds at the nests. There's a lot of story with the birds on the Texas Gulf Coast and all the challenges that are there. But what's the focus with ICF moving forward with this iconic tallest bird in North America? And what are your hopes for it? And
what a journey,
huh? Yeah.
Well, I think a few things I would reflect on. One is, to me, reintroductions are the testimony for why we have to keep cranes wild in the first place. You know, there's all this talk now of rewilding, and I often think that people involved in all this work don't really fully appreciate how hard it is to bring a species back when you've lost it. But just the struggle of bringing back the whooping crane, you just outlined it, like so much learning from the original pairing of the birds, you know, and just getting them to pair even in captivity, to teaching migration routes, to finding suitable habitat for them, to all the challenges we've had in the last 10 years of black flies on the reintroduced population and predators galore and maybe behavioral issues. And so to me, like, the number one lesson is keep them wild in the first place, like everything we can do. And fortunately we did, right? With the Texas, with the Aransas wood buffalo whoopers, we did by a hair, by a real thin thread. We kept them wild. And I appreciate all the reintroduction efforts, because they were all done at a time, especially when whooping cranes were few, and they were, by any reasonable measure, critically endangered, just truly at the brink of extinction. And, today it's great. We sit with, 500 to 600 in the wild. I don't know the count this year, 560, 80, something like that. Yeah. Anyway, so enough that I think they're still very much endangered for the reasons you said, narrow migration corridor, so many challenges, but they're not at like the brink of extinction anymore. They've come out of that super tense zone to a little bit better zone. And I think it gives us multiple pathways to recover these birds. One is just the continued flourishing of that original population, which puts less pressure on the success of the reintroductions. And to me, I think Louisiana will succeed. Full stop. There's amazing habitat down there. There were birds there. They're non-migratory, which reduces the challenges a lot. And here, I'm very hopeful we'll succeed too. But the challenges we face for the EMP with predators and maybe other issues, is really extreme. And it's nice to these birds don't have to succeed for the species to recover, because they're doing so well in the original flyway. And, the real reason for this reintroduction is now as much social as ecological. Even if we decide at some point, maybe this population we can't make it self-sustaining without putting birds out. And we haven't decided that. But if we reach that point, I still think the states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, they're connected to these birds now. And when you get these whoopers in your lives, people aren't going to let go easily. So there'll be a sort of a social push to keep them going, whatever that means. I think long after, whether they become self-sustaining or we decide for whatever reason they can't be in this kind of, more marginal part of their original range, I think, where we're struggling more. So it's an interesting story. But, you mentioned our 10-year vision. What I'm so excited about is growing and placing more effort on the original Aransas wood buffalo population. The birds that so well from all your work. But we have worked intensively in Texas now for about 15 years, trying to help those birds. We've always kept in touch with the Canadians. at Wood Buffalo with the great teams on the Platte, kind of what they're doing, but never really did much between Texas and Wood Buffalo. Never really did that much north of Texas. And I think the new vision, I mentioned before, Andy, who's really championed this, is to really take the same whole flyway approach for whooping cranes that we've had in years in Asia, where we've focused on the full flyway for 4 different endangered Asian species very intensively. We haven't done it here. Part of it is there are great partners everywhere, but still I think there's a niche, a role we can have. And so paying more attention to that great flyway, where the critical stops are, what's needed, how can we gap fill, build up partnerships, maybe add a staff position on the ground that can help make something happen. So really thinking holistically about that whooping crane natural flyway and making that our top priority for the decade ahead. That's what I see, getting those numbers up until we feel more and more safe. And then, as I say, when we do downlist them or delist them someday, it will be a celebration, all of us. You'll be there, we'll be there, well, I'll be there, and we'll be celebrating the downlisting, not fighting it. We'll say the time is right, these birds are no longer endangered, we're good with this.
So speaking of that, I mean, that's a good segue to the From the Field webinar series that's so great with ICF. The latest one, after your 10-year vision, the one that just was yesterday, perhaps, or 2 days ago, was on the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah.
And the risk of whooping cranes and others that are on that act. So could you give us a real quick summary of what you see?
Yeah. I have never saw the Endangered Species Act as perfect legislation, but a really important tool. And I think there are threats, 2 important changes that will affect that tool dramatically for those of us who need it to save species. And whooping cranes still need the Endangered Species Act. And there's 2 things we're reading into the rewording, subtle rewording of the Endangered Species Act that are very concerning. One is redefining harm to be mortality. So speaking directly, mortality may be power line collisions, it may be shootings, but there's a lot of mortality that happens indirectly through loss of habitat. We know that the recovery of the whooping crane, just like the sandhill crane, was fueled by protections to direct threats and habitat, and they go hand in hand. So our biggest alarm bell is the idea that habitat would not be part and parcel of the Endangered Species Act, that it would just focus on direct mortality, which is just such a narrow way to look at anything, a plant, an animal, us. Without our habitat, what are we? Where we don't exist. So that is a very unfortunate change, very worrisome change, because usually loss of habitat protection is done for a reason, and that would be to develop areas in ways that are not friendly to cranes and wildlife. So that's what we assume is behind those kind of changes. We don't know if that's for things we need, like energy production, or things we don't really want, like new coastal houses that are right in the middle of habitat or whatever. But for whatever it is, that's the number one concern, is this redefinition of harm to be very specific to direct loss. And then the other one's more subtle and hard to interpret, would certainly end up in the courts, but it's this sense of intentionality that's implied also, and that's that the direct mortality has to be intentional. And that would basically fully and completely gut the Endangered Species Act, because between losing habitat protection and forcing the plaintiff to say that was intentional, that shooting of that crane was intentional, that power line that you ran right through their roosting and breeding ground was intentional to kill those cranes, very hard to do. I'm sure the energy companies didn't mean to kill any cranes when they ran their power line through the worst possible place for cranes. But really, what do you do, right? So we need those legal safeguards. So I worry about those 2 things. There's other things, but those are the 2 biggies to me that we're kind of rallying on. We're careful at the International Crane Foundation. We don't get in lots of political battles. We're not partisan. We really believe cranes need us to work across the rural urban divide more than ever, everywhere. But some things just are not good for our country or our wildlife, and that change, the Endangered Species Act, is not good for any of us. So we're fighting it. Yeah. Hopefully, certainly fighting it by encouraging everyone to comment on it and doing our best to try to influence those changes, and with a common sense kind of approach. I believe that if the Endangered Species Act, as much opposition as there is to it in some quarters, I think fundamentally people would oppose taking down the Endangered Species Act. So this is a clever way to render it useless without the pomp and circumstance of taking out one of our premier pieces of legislation in the world, right? It's a global model, absolute global model since 1973. But it's a subtler way to do all that.
So you and I have kids that are roughly the same age. And I work with young people at the University of Nebraska. You work with young people here at ICF. What do you tell young people in this generation that are passionate about the natural world, passionate about their role in the environment? What do you tell this generation today that has been, in their own way, so much, what I think anyway, is a very pivotal moment in our country's history here and in our world's history, frankly, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What do I say the most? A few things. I think in a practical way, kids who are impassioned for this, I really encourage to get in the field as much as possible and really connect with nature. I think a lot of people going into conservation careers are sort of surprisingly separate from birds and plants and what I'll call sort of taxonomy. I heard that when I was up and coming. I heard some of the old guys, that would be talking, saying, "Oh, nobody knows plants anymore." Yeah. Nobody. But there's a truth to that, and I really try to encourage my older son is very committed to conservation, but I also encourage him to learn his trees, learn his plants, learn his birds, get that deeper connection, because that keeps that passion going. Because there's no life of discovery like the natural world, right? It is an endless life of discovery. We were doing this birdathon, we're talking about, we learned so much just doing that. You just see things, hear things, smell things. It's wonderful. So that's one. What I see in my kids is it's sort of the good and the damage done of how we deal with our climate crisis. I think for our kids, climate is a huge top issue. There are several issues that are, I think, top for that generation of sort of early college and high school age students and all right now, and where my kids fall in. And climate change is a big one. And my kids have said to me, the difference between your generation and my generation, Dad, is that your generation still thinks you can stop climate change, and we're just about adapting to it, basically. Yeah. They've taken it as fait accompli. They see our governments as absolutely incompetent to deal with it. They don't have any of the hope that we of those of us who came from like the Endangered Species Act era, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, all that monumental legislation, we still somehow hold that that's gonna deliver us. And I think this generation has completely rejected that as unrealistic and are just focused on sort of adaptation and things like that. That's what I sense anyway. So that's why I encourage getting out, knowing nature. Part of how we will adapt and deal with our changing climate is understanding what's affected. And I was just reading this fantastic book on caracaras. So I've had caracaras on my mind for the last couple of weeks and how smart they are, these amazing birds. And at the end of this book, there's like this amazing population of caracaras stuck on the Falkland Islands, of all places, off of Argentina, that are dwindling out. And at the end of this book, this guy he's such a caracariac. He so loves these birds, and it's like our craniac world. And he's like making the case to just move these birds. They're going to die out. Move them into Argentina, move them onto the land, and sort of give them a chance. And I think things like that might be part of our future. I'm not really a rewilding. I'm not really looking to bring mastodons back, but I think so much about the lesson of the whooping cranes of save it first in the wild. Like, don't lose that wild population. We may never bring them back. Yeah. 25 years of reintroduction here in Wisconsin. And, that's another example. Maybe we should just accept some responsibility in the fate of some of these species, and those that can adapt, maybe we help them think about things differently, not just accept that they're going to die out. And I think that's where the next generation could really take off, because maybe they won't put so much energy that we're putting into sort of big picture of stopping climate change, because it probably is too late. Yep. In many meaningful ways, it's probably too late. But I think we can save some species and plants and animals. And, if we kind of get our minds around how can we best bring along as much wildlife as possible in our changing world, And right now, I almost feel like that's a taboo subject because it's like acquiescence to climate change, it's like, but somehow we've got to transition to that, to saving what we got one way or the other, and maybe doing some extraordinary measures to do that. So I think about that and think that could be a fantastic thing for the next generation coming up to really focus energy on. And I think learning your plants and animals will help a lot, having that personal connection that's so important for us, obviously. And anyway, I don't know. I don't ever get in that long of a speech to these kids, but since you gave me the time to give a longer speech, I just have to get that down to 1 minute. And I
know.
So
I agree with you. And it's at this point, it's all about experience and making it personal. The world that's out there is not just out there, it's in there, and it's in all of us. And I've never met anybody on the face of the earth that's never stopped and taken a moment to look at a beautiful sunset. There's something that's innate in all of us that is there, that spark, that we're not apart from nature, we are part of nature. And it's all one thing together, and there's this beautiful reciprocity that can take place that maybe we understand, maybe we don't. Certainly many cultures around the world have understood that and continue to, but it's just making it personal. And I think cranes are such a great doorway. Birds are such a great doorway because they're everywhere. Plants are a great doorway because you can live in the middle of a concrete jungle and you still can see a tree, still persevere. See something that's there. So, which maybe gets me to the last thing I want to ask you about. And you're a professional, you're a scientist. To me, your power, just like it has been with those that have come before you, with Jim Harris and George and others, is the power of a story. Is there a story about an individual crane that is really, really personal to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. Individual cranes, as a true individual, in a lot of ways, I probably would loop back to here and some of the cranes that I knew from my early days at ICF in captivity, which is very different than how I would answer that in the wild. For example, this bird wolf here that we had, the Siberian crane, just extraordinary to have a bird that had survived since World War I, had survived World War II in Europe, and ended up here and was still dancing. And I learned from our aviculture team that they were getting, viable semen from this bird when he was I think in his 70s or some pretty extraordinary age, given their 25 year lifespan in the wild. So they were using the bird for artificial insemination until pretty late in his life. So some of those birds, there is a way at our site here to connect personally with the birds that is pretty amazing, maybe going way back to my Tai Chi days here. Right. But it's something I so take for granted. I kind of have to force myself off my laptop on a beautiful day and get out and just walk a loop around the cranes, because many days can go by without walking the less than quarter a mile to our exhibits. It happens all the time, but it's always a great opportunity to connect with these birds. And sometimes I often jump up a level, so instead of giving you a bird, I'm kind of giving you a experience. But I think getting out and the joy of watching some of these birds raise a chick on display is really extraordinary too. And for the birds in captivity, it really is special because you're just so much closer in the wild. And when I give tours at ICF, I often talk about the fact that when you see these African cranes, the crown cranes or the wattled and the blue crane, you are 10 to 20 times closer than you will ever see them in the wild in most cases, except for a few exceptional cases. So you can really experience these birds in a very different way. A lot of my work in Africa, really, I couldn't think of a story to an individual because it is more abstract. It's working for populations. It's working to see that birds flying into the roost, that kind of stuff, magical, but very different than a kind of a one-to-one sort of relationship. So
that's a great answer, though, because I think a lot of folks don't understand the jewel that is here. I've met a lot of people in the crane world that they know of the International Crane Foundation, but they don't know all that it is, and they don't know that they can truly experience a world of cranes right here in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and that's pretty cool.
It is. They're cool birds. Yeah.
So, Rich, we're on We're on this beautiful campus, the International Crane Foundation, South Central Wisconsin in the Baraboo Hills. It just doesn't magically work here. How do people support the International Crane Foundation? How do they learn more about the Crane Foundation? How do they get involved?
Great. Well, since I am CEO, I have to start with the money and say we are grateful for support. Any CEO doesn't start with the money is probably lying. So no, we are grateful for the support. We have a lot of supporters, and it makes our work possible. It's just full stop. There's no question about that. So we're really grateful for that. There's lots of ways to learn more about us. We've talked about visiting here, and I really encourage people who can to visit us here. We're right off the interstate that connects Boston to Seattle. You know, we can be part of any great American journey. And it's a wonderful site. We're open May through October and experience these birds up close and personal. And if you come later in the fall, see a lot of birds in the wild too, which is nice. We have had extraordinary volunteers. ICF was originally a volunteer organization from the get-go. Nobody got paid in the early years. And last year we give an award called the Good Egg Award for people that do wonderful things for us. And we awarded our three current longest serving volunteers last year. And the minimum criteria to make the list was 30 years. These are people that have done tour guides, helped care for chicks, helped with crane counts, done this and that. And so, originally when we went into this, I thought, we could honor everybody. Let's say 20 years and over, which is a pretty good benchmark. Yeah. And it was too many to name. So we have extraordinary volunteers, and they help us out. They pour wine when we have an event they do it all. So it's just great. So there really are, obviously that's a limited geography, but wonderful ways for people to help us statewide. People do the annual crane count. Right. That's a fun way to get out. So there are real hands-on ways to get involved. And we do a lot of school curricula and try and reach out to kids through our outreach programs, really worldwide. That's very active across Africa and in China and other places. So there are direct ways to learn more and get involved. And we do a lot of webinars, and we put our webinars on YouTube. We call it the Crane Tube. And there's probably 60 or more on there now that you can access about anything. So if you want to know about cranes in Uganda, you can go and find one or two talks there, which is fun. A lot of them are about an hour long and very informational. And our website certainly has a lot of information and lots of links to partners and work worldwide. So those are some of the ways. I think there's lots of easy ways to learn a lot more about cranes. And then, if you have a chance to come here, that's probably the number one way to connect. Or you can go someplace amazing like the Platte and have a life-altering experience there to connect with these birds. But it's good to get out.
And just so people understand, this organization started 52 years ago with 2-3 people. And today, roughly how many, I know you got off a staff call this morning before you came here, which is...
We have about 150 people that are really core. They're either on direct payroll or the equivalent of payroll contract levels. It's about that. We get I think close to 30 interns and associates a year just here. I forget the number. We recently lengthened some. It might be somewhere 25 to 30. And then we have a lot of interns overseas. We're meeting some we had a global call today, which covered 14 time zones. We had people from the Midwest all the way to China and everywhere in between. 4 different time zones in Africa today, from Senegal to Southern Africa to in Ethiopia and all the way across. It was really fun. So those are wonderful things. And we started a phrase, it was kind of during COVID, this we called One ICF, and we say greetings, One ICF, hello, One ICF. And to me, with 150 people, we're probably one of the bigger conservation organizations in Wisconsin, if not the biggest. And we're one of the only global in Wisconsin, but we're small compared to a global nature conservancy or World Wildlife Fund for sure. By orders of magnitude, we're smaller. But the benefit we have is we can still connect as a community. And if someone from China can talk to somebody in Zambia, to somebody in Texas, to somebody in Wisconsin about the same work, how are you dealing with power lines? How are you dealing with wetland loss, water? Whatever. And that's a wonderful thing. And our new vision is partly about working to maintain that sense of One ICF and define, rather than always wishing to be bigger, wishing to rise to the TNCs of the world. It's just to recognize they have their wonderful place, great organization, and we have ours and our size, and we can take advantage of that and really connect people in our world with that. So yeah, that's just a fun way to think about ourselves in a way. It's sort of caught on. I've become a big proponent of that. And that's not easy. That tent is not easy. Just like, we are a very diverse world. It's a lot of languages, a lot of religious beliefs, a lot of fundamental values and beliefs. And trying to big tent all that in an organization is very hard.
Yeah.
If anybody is 100% happy, we probably failed. It's like you can't, we're just too different, as people. So it's compromise, but it's ways to put the emphasis on what's most important, creating this very inclusive atmosphere across the organization that anybody can be a craniac, anybody can be part of the team, and yeah, anyway, that's it. I don't even remember what your question was, but that's my answer.
No, that's a great answer. It's a lot to carry on your shoulders, but I know you're not carrying it all alone.
Yeah.
I also know that you can't lead if you don't have hope. Nobody will follow. What's your hope?
I have a lot of hope. Part of it in a sort of micro way comes from the remarkable resiliency of cranes, their ability to change with us. And when I started at ICF, I was mentioning like Wattle cranes and Saris cranes. We were very much focused on I was focused on water conditions in a very narrow way to keep these birds alive, meet their food sources. And those are still incredibly important, but the birds have proven to be resilient. They can ride out bad years now and then. And that gives me a lot of hope. I think as much as I worry about climate change and global change, and I worry a lot about those things, I think our planet has a resiliency in many regards that gives me some hope. We're not going to save everything by a long shot, but some things will make it. And I'm hoping the cranes are an example of a family of birds that can make it and really show somehow how we're going to live in this new world of ours. And that does give me hope. And then the other big way I draw hope is just for all the people in our universe of craniac world that are working so hard and different, in such diverse ways for a better future for cranes, for wetlands and all of that. And that's going to generate some good. There's no question about it. We're not going to save everything, but it's going to do some good as we change. So that's my hope. Yeah.
Well, I'm with you, man. So, you and I have never really sat down and had a conversation. It's always
running around. Yeah,
running around, seeing each other. It's been really fascinating today, and I've learned a lot about you as a person, but also as a leader, and where this thread that we've pulled through this last hour comes from. And it's really cool, Rich. So I appreciate your time.
It's a great pleasure. I have tremendous admiration for your work, and I just love it. And I also have tremendous jealousy for your ability to get in the field and do all the things I would love to think I could do, but actually couldn't do, like lying in a tent for 2 weeks.
Oh,
that's beyond me now.
You can do that just fine, and I'm battling the same thing you've battled in your life too, about figuring out how to stay in the field.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rich. These are the Whooping Crane Chronicles. Appreciate everybody joining. Stay tuned.